Hello and welcome to the Hydrogen Interview, where we ask what's next in the hydrogen market and perhaps most importantly, what should be next. I'm very glad to have Emmanuel Bianco with us today. He is a program officer at International Renewable Energy Agency, which of course we all know as IRENA. Emmanuel, thank you very much for joining us again. I remember our chat last year and I very much enjoyed it. So I'm looking forward to diving in today.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me today.
Well, it's good timing with your recent report, Green Hydrogen for Industry, a Guide to Policymaking. And that's a relevant case in point if there ever was one. Clearly, there's a lot of ambiguity on this, hence the need for a report. And we know that the world of policymaking can be extremely convoluted, slow, burdened by the start-stop between governments and the private sector, even when it's well-meaning intentions. So when we throw a largely untested market like clean hydrogen into this mix, that ante is ramped up, making that report more relevant than ever. From your perspective, what really stood out when you signed on the dotted line and said that report is now, with your team has now come to an end? What was the point that really stood out to you that we need to focus on going forward?
Well, yes, thank you. The main point is the fact that it's still not very well understood, in my opinion, the fact that green hydrogen is an infant industry. It's a small industry that needs to be sheltered and protected from competition from the fossil fuel-based one. And the classic approach to infant industry is to make industrial policy making, which means a very specific set of actions that somehow fell out of fashion, in particular in Europe and countries that embraced the free market and believed that industrial policymaking was somehow an inefficient way for the government to control the private sector. I must say that since 2008, with the financial crisis and the growth of the renewable energy industry, in reality, industrial policymaking returned in fashion. And we saw actually a very specific quality of this new industrial policymaking, that is the fact that the industrial policymaking is connected with societal and sustainability issues now. So it's not completely new what we're talking about, support, protect your industry in order to be decarbonized, but it's still to be fully embraced so that policymakers can take decisions following decisions that were already taken in the last century a lot of times.
Is there a risk of a bit of a chicken and egg there, in the sense that if industry and other stakeholders have more clarity about the supply demand levels and they have more clarity about the next steps, which of course is provided by policy, that therefore they will move faster, whereas the policy makers at the moment are waiting to see how the market develops? So how to get over that chicken egg scenario of which comes first?
Yeah, no, that's actually one of the barriers that we identified in the report. So fact is, yes, that we need a strategy out there. We already saw a lot of national strategies, and they are actually addressing this issue. So when a policymaker starts writing it, when these are published, you can see that there is an intention to grow the supply and grow the demand at the same time and make them meet. It's not always the case, however, because sometimes the strategies are all about export. So they are not creating a local demand. And this, I believe, can become an issue because the first batches of green hydrogen are not going to be exported. On the hydrogen that is going to be produced in the GCC region or in Chile or in Austria, the first batches of hydrogen are likely to be consumed locally. And if there is not a local demand, there is a risk that the supply will not actually happen because the offtake risk is just too big. And of course, if there is no infrastructure, everything will remain on paper. So what it must be done is to plan together, and again, this is an industrial policy that I'm talking about, plan together where the first batches of green hydrogen will be consumed. And this can be true for any country, because even if it's pretty invisible, also in our energy statistics, hydrogen is consumed in a lot of industries already today. 87 megatons of hydrogen are consumed every year. So there is a demand to be decarbonized first. And of course, it's first the industrial sector.
Indeed. And I think it's worth pointing out something else that you said in there at the beginning. Obviously you said about the clean hydrogen market and that acknowledgement and that understanding broadly that it is an infant market. It is very, very much emerging. It's so early in its life. And when we look at those hydrogen national strategies, I read 25 last year for a research project, 25 of them, and the difference in countries' strategies, that some were incredibly detailed and looking, like you say, at the end use, looking at supply demand, so on, financing packages. And that went, I mean, even that wasn't as in-depth as perhaps it would need to be, but those are the best case scenarios. And we'll take Europe out of the equation completely in this. And then I went, to the other end of the scale, where it was essentially in a statement of intent and far more brief on what was needed. And that as well feeds into the policy making world when it comes to hydrogen. And I think it's very important that the community specifies on a country basis, or as you just did, on an industrial basis, because there really is no one rule suits all with this, and that there is a risk there, where, especially when talking about the Middle East, that we talk about the Middle East hydrogen strategy, or within the Middle East there's such difference, and there's different resources to different financial capacity, regulatory ambition. We could go on and on. So I think that factors very interestingly into it as well. I mean, what would you, if you had your absolute wish list for this year when it comes to policy, because obviously we're talking about something that's going to stretch over decades. So if we bring it to the near term, to this year, so what would you hope to see when it comes to policy this year for hydrogen in the UAE, the Middle East?
Okay, so first of
big
all,
question, Emmanuel.
yeah, it's a big question. First of all, just for your interest, the IRENA and the World Economic Forum wrote together a roadmap of policies to enable green hydrogen trade. Now, we focused on Europe and Japan for starting. And it's a list of 50 policies, actually, more or less 54, so that would support the import of green hydrogen. We're going to focus on different venues in the future, still together with the World Economic Forum, and the Middle East is, of course, one of the areas where we're going to focus. Now, what we should see here, it's a lot of different from the rest of the world, because the WACC, the weighted average cost of capital, is so low that it allows already at the beginning of first projects like the one of Aqua Power in Saudi Arabia, that can already produce a large amount of green hydrogen without too much dedicated policy support. But what we are actually seeing is the fact that there is already an enabling environment for producing green hydrogen. But as I said, without an offtake of that green hydrogen, there is a risk of basically having a cathedral in the desert waiting for the hydrogen to be demanded and the infrastructure to be there. And we don't have yet standardization, we don't have yet regulation, certification of green hydrogen, and all these aspects needs to be addressed in collaboration with the importing countries. Because when you are talking, yes, tell me.
Do you think that, I mean, that's a long list, and then we have that list, and then we have the national targets, for example, in the UAE and other countries for the early 2030s, or for 2030 even. And of course, we know there are issues with the price point as well when it comes to electrolyzers and other parts of that value chain. How realistic is it that we can get there? Do you feel that progress is moving fast enough to make that possible?
That's a very big question that I'm not actually ready to answer, because I'm sure that we are going to see some breakthrough in the technology, in the manufacturing capacity of electrolyzers. That is the big question. And honestly, I believe also one of the main bottlenecks, once we have the electrolyzers able to be replicated at the scale we actually need. And let's remember, for now we have around 300 megawatts of electrolyzers in the world to produce green hydrogen. we need around 5 terawatt. So yeah, some 1,000 times more. And
Exactly.
for now, we just don't have the manufacturing capacity to reach those targets. So I believe that what will be needed in order to kickstart a green hydrogen market also in this region is also to answer a question, which is where the region wants to be in the next 10, 20, and 30 years. Because for now, the region is basically split between two markets. The Asian market, Japan, South Korea, where blue hydrogen is a possibility. We have seen Japan importing blue ammonia from Saudi Arabia, some from Brunei, and the first liquid hydrogen shipping being delivered from Australia that was purely black, gray hydrogen from coal. And in the other part of the world, Europe, that is setting higher and higher standards to define what is green hydrogen. It must be renewable, from additional capacity, with temporal and geographical correlation, and the same rules will apply also for imported hydrogen, and they want that to be imported in Europe in the size of 10 megatons by 2030. So there is a huge market for a very specific product. But if the region does not decide to invest heavily in this very specific technology with this very strict regulation, there's a risk that that role will be taken from someone else, from other regions, which is not be bad, because let's remember that the story of hydrogen will not be the story of a cartel. Hydrogen cannot be cartelized, and every region that can produce hydrogen is likely to produce hydrogen by 2050 and to export it. Because basically it's very much possible to produce it everywhere at a similar price point by 2050. We are going to produce a report about that on hydrogen trade, and the demand will be there. However, investing in blue hydrogen now will mean creating stranded assets in the future. And I don't see investors willing to invest in a technology to use that CCS for 10 years, 15 years, and then receive the order. No, by the way, you cannot produce it anymore. This is not anymore requested. It is possible that there will be no more demand for blue hydrogen by 2050 if it does not achieve very low emissions, below what was the recent studies said 98% of carbon capture and storage and 0.2% of methane leakage. Maybe if they manage to reach that, it can become an actually consumed blue hydrogen. Otherwise, there's a risk that it will become just a standard asset.
And reaching it at that scale that we're talking about, with that level of supply and demand as well, has other complexities in there. In terms of talking about these cross-border partnerships that, you know, we see these very exciting headlines: Germany, Saudi, Russia. This was last year, obviously, not something that's in the headlines now. We see, like you mentioned, Japan, Australia, India as well. You know, there's a lot of very exciting headlines out there about pending partnerships, current partnerships for R&D and so on. But do you think that without carbon pricing, without stronger, more established mechanisms for pricing carbon on a regional, national basis, I won't go as far as saying global, that's a long way off, but do you think that these sorts of partnerships, when it comes to keeping these supply chains clean, when it comes to being able to price effectively and forecast effectively, do you think that can be done without more carbon pricing mechanisms in the Middle East?
So that's another good question, because what we have seen in the past was that without those carbon pricing, without the carbon prices needed for solar PV and wind to be developed, we still saw that being developed.
Yeah.
Even if the polluters did not pay the right tax, the right fee for the damage they made to our planet, we are still seeing renewable energy being developed. And it is unlikely that carbon pricing will achieve the values that are needed in the short term to cover the cost gap between, for example, green steel and gray steel, making not the business case for steel makers to invest in green hydrogen. it is more likely that this decision will be taken from law mandating a change or supporting it. So again, industrial policy making. And when we're talking about this trade, these are going to exist because there will be someone willing to buy, even at an extra cost, a very valuable asset, a very valuable commodity that can be green hydrogen or very decarbonized blue hydrogen. I must say that I'm very excited to see in Europe the carbon border adjustment mechanism being discussed. That's basically, it's big. It's very big because it's an import tax based on carbon content. Just the fact that we are discussing this is throwing away years of policy making on globalization without and policy to basically cut import taxes. We are going to see an import tax based on carbon content, which basically is going to say, we want to collaborate. We want you to start producing green hydrogen, you being whatever region in the world, and we are going to prefer your green production to any other green production. It can be a collaborative measure. And the fact that the US and Europe signed an agreement, a trade agreement, to exchange steel and aluminum based on carbon content, and open the venue for other countries to sign it as well, it means that the topic is not, it's not just for Europe, that has always been a bit more progressive and on the forefront for climate policies, but it's going to be everywhere. It's going to be the new norm. And there will be an opportunity for everyone to join and to have a big market for their green products. So I dare to say that we are going to see a different world in policymaking because of this. And these kind of policies are basically going to revolutionize how industry is acting. We are already seeing this because since Germany and Europe published their green hydrogen strategies, countries around the world, investors around the world are already developing concepts and projects that will be fit to these strategies. And basically, we are seeing the demand side, the industry already changing the way the supply side is being developed.
Indeed. And like you say, it starts to set a completely different tone when you have regions and countries like that collaborating, and it turns something from being theoretical into, no, this is really on the table, this is going to become an economic matter, and really now's the time to get onto the right side of it as well. And the risk of stranded assets, you know, that phrase, it's lingering in so many boardrooms at the moment. When do we move? How fast do we move? Is what we lose with our stranded assets going to be less than what we can gain? And where is that tipping point? And it's an incredibly hard question that nobody has the answer to yet. And I think there'll be something on a policy side that will have to be pushed by policy and pushed by policies will end up making the decisions for companies faster than perhaps than they're able to make it. Looking at market forces. Manuel, thank you so much. As always, I really enjoyed that, and I feel like we could probably talk for several more hours on this. It's probably a good job we're in different countries. I think we'd end up over many coffees. Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. The whole team does, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. And please, to the audience, please check our IRENA website. We have a very big piece of knowledge, not only from the policy unit, but from all the divisions. And I believe that they can be instrumental to move things forward.
I would echo that. I've read the reports and it is very detailed, very interesting. And like I said at the beginning, it's very, very much needed. And there's a lot of opacity out there that needs to be clarified. And this is exactly the sort of steps that can happen to get us there. So thank you very much, Manuel, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.